views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting groups. If you'd like to produce a show, call us at 260-421-1250.
Let me be your lighthouse so I can show you the way. Let me be your shining light, I'll keep you from drifting away. I'm the one that makes you try when...
Hello, this is Patty Hunter of Patty's Page. This afternoon we are interviewing our special guest, Dr. David Prentice, PhD. You are the Vice President and Research Director of Charlotte Lozier Institute. Did I say it right?
No, that's it.
All right. So basically, briefly tell us about yourself, where you're born and all that, where you're raised.
Sure. Well, I'm a native Kansan, born and bred. Was actually born in western Kansas, near La Crosse, but grew up in eastern Kansas, south of Kansas City. We had a little farm just outside of a tiny town called Parker, Kansas. Had a little bit of everything on the farm growing up, but Dad actually worked as an electrician on construction, which ended up being one of the jobs that I did part-time to help Dad as sort of his helper growing up. Went to the local, grade school, high school. Of course, Kansas at that point then had consolidated a lot of the districts. Our junior high, senior high school was called the Prairie View Buffaloes. Good Kansas name there. As I was growing up, I had a very good friend that we just kind of did everything together. But when it came time to go to college, he went to the ag school in Kansas, Kansas State, and I went to the other school, University of Kansas. Did my actually both my bachelor's and my doctorate there at KU, bachelor's in cell biology and doctorate in biochemistry.
Were you into bioethics?
Not really at that point. It was kind of all the focus was on the science part, and there weren't a lot of questions certainly at that point popping up like we're dealing with now and have been for the last, 2-3 decades. So, but I've been doing science and doing experiments and teaching science and talking about science now for over 40 years. I did a postdoc at Los Alamos National Lab in New Mexico, more science and so on. My first faculty position was at University of Texas Med School in Houston, and taught and did research there, but kind of wanted to get back more towards the Midwest. And so I ended up taking a position at Indiana State University in Terre Haute, Indiana, and had a joint appointment at IU Med School because, as your listeners are probably aware, in Indiana, you farm out at least the first couple of years, have all these various med centers around, and then they go for their clinical time at Indianapolis. So I taught med students, I taught grad students, I taught undergrads, I taught non-majors, kind of the whole raft of things from beginning non-majors biology to very specialized courses on cell biology and embryology and so on and so forth. And it was probably about that time that people started asking the bioethics questions. Now, I'd been a Christian and a pro-lifer since my teens.
Right.
But the question really never came up in science classes that I was taking with my colleagues. There really weren't too many issues, of course, other than abortion at that point in time. But as I was then becoming a faculty member, and then we started having Dolly the cloned sheep. We started having in the
Yes,
late 90s
I remember that.
embryonic stem cells and all sorts of,
Yes.
we'll just say, a little bit of weird science, but things that really were pushing the envelope. And a lot of folks, including a lot of my science colleagues, were talking about how isn't this great, and we're gonna cure everything, of course, using clones and harvesting their organs and tissues, or destroying human embryos, or of course fetal tissue, aborting the baby and then taking her hearts or livers or brains and so on. The things that, you know, your listeners have probably seen those videos that David Daleiden did a few years ago, undercover citizen journalist, where he went into some of these abortion clinics for Planned Parenthood and exposed the fact that they were buying and selling baby body parts and trafficking in them, selling them to these researchers who thought they were doing all this great science. Well,
Guess what?
it's not great science, and it's never been great science, either from the ethics or from just the scientific aspect.
These are human beings we're destroying.
Yeah, but you know, a lot of people, a lot of scientists will just say, didn't even think about the ethical issue. It's just not something that, again, a lot of scientists worked with. So I spent about almost 20 years at Indiana State and this joint appointment at IU Med.
Yeah.
And then I kept getting asked to explain the science and explain the ethics, because now those questions were coming up with fetal tissue and stem cells and embryos and cloning. And, you know, did a lot of traveling for a while, and then ended up in Washington, D.C., because some of the people who wanted to know about the real facts, and especially the ethics, were members of Congress. I had a good friend who got elected to Congress in the 90s, and he would call up and say, hey, give me the 2-minute lecture on cancer research, or, you know, tell me about embryos and what's going on. They were interested in knowing, and unfortunately there weren't a lot of people who were telling them the truth about the ethical aspect, that young human beings were being destroyed and then parted out like you'd part out a car that you'd stolen to sell bits and pieces and so on. So I worked at Family Research Council for about 10 years, explaining science, still doing that same thing. Left the academic world, but you know, in a sense, it was still the professor's job. It just was a different makeup in the class that I was trying to teach.
So they call you an expert now?
Pardon?
Do they call you an expert now?
They did. I was certainly one of the few from the pro-life side who were trying to talk about what was really going on with this research, and if you will, expose the empty promises that they were making. Like I said, I had several people talk about how, oh, embryonic stem cells, it's going to cure all known maladies. Like it's going to cure everything. And I looked at the scientific papers and go, they haven't proven anything. And they haven't helped a single person. In fact, they've destroyed a lot of lives. Where in the meantime, if you looked at the science, what we now call adult stem cells, bone marrow transplants, and now from adult stem cells from other parts of the born individual, especially from adults, not just bone marrow, but almost every tissue in your body has these adult stem cells. Oh, let's see, those have now treated over 2 million people around the world. The score is still 0 on the embryonic stem cell side of the ledger.
Why do they think they have to use the embryonic?
There's this thought in some scientific circles that the younger the cells, the younger the tissue, the better. It really started back in the 1960s when they were dealing with fetal tissues and fetal cells, which we'll discuss a little bit more when we get to talking about the vaccines, but they were taking an organ or a tissue from an aborted baby. They would put some of those cells in culture and then get them to grow, and some of them frankly have been growing for decades now in there. But there are other ways to do this, as we have found out. The adult stem cells, you don't have to go to harvesting and cannibalizing the youngest human beings for this research. You can do the same. In fact, you can do better doing ethical research that doesn't destroy a single life.
Yes.
And that's the stuff that's working too.
You said abortion, they're doing it for the good of the woman, or this and that, woman's rights and all that.
Yeah, there are all sorts of justifications people like to come up with, but that issue, we've been fighting on the whole issue of the fetal tissue research, and actually under President Trump and Secretary Azar, we're able to get some of that money taken away from those people that were trafficking in aborted baby tissues and organs, and get that towards the successful and ethical research just within the last few years.
People are becoming more aware of what's happened to the wee babies. For years, we were kind of blinded
Sure.
by the abortionists and Planned Parenthood. We have a big Planned Parenthood here. That you're going to be starting chemical abortions now.
Yeah, that's a growing problem throughout the United States, definitely, because they see it as a way to sort of slip in under the radar.
It's
this is even worse. They're still interested in making money, let's face it.
Mhm.
And they're still interested in our taxpayer money.
Yeah.
But now they can, if you will, reap a higher profit because they can just prescribe a couple of pills to the woman. And if you think about this in terms of that chemical abortion versus surgical, you're destroying life, definitely.
Right.
But this is an even more egregious abuse of the woman, because you give her these chemicals and you send her home to go through this by herself on her own. Frankly, the problems that happen are more serious, including a lot of bleeding that can happen with the chemical abortion. There's about a 4 or 5 times greater rate of problems with the chemical abortion than with the surgical. In every case, of course, you're destroying lives, but you're risking the woman's life at an even higher rate now with the chemical abortion. And it's something that people need to be aware of.
The abortionists do not care. They think they're doing a good thing for the woman, but they're not. And my late aunt was an abortionist. She did out of a male clinic, in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
Took me a long time to forgive her. Long time.
It's definitely prayer is probably our strongest weapon here that we have, and we need to deploy that continuously in these issues.
Yes, yes. You are with Charlotte Lozier Institute. What does that do?
Yeah, Charlotte Lozier Institute. We're the research and education arm of the Susan B. Anthony list. It's a pro-life but political sort of organization. I'm sure your listeners have heard of. We're the geeks at the end of the hall.
Right.
Our motto is science and statistics for life. And so we do a whole lot of background research on life issues, whether it's abortion and chemical abortion, whether it's stem cells, whether it's things about maternal mortality, and trying to decrease that because you're decreasing abortion, and vaccines, the hot topic on everybody's lips nowadays. But we do that sort of background deep dive research, and then try to publish our information, not just for the academics, but also publish it in a way so that everybody can have access to it. And again, open eyes to the truth. So we provide that information to the general public. We provide that information to advocates, to members of Congress and state legislatures, and just try and make sure they've got all of the real facts when they go into these sorts of debates.
You mentioned vaccines, and what's that got to do with babies, stem cell?
And it does have a connection. And here's the connection I mentioned before. Back in the 1960s, they were taking aborted baby organs and growing some of those cells in the laboratory. And once they've started those cells growing in that dish, you can keep them growing for quite a while. In fact, there's even a technique where you can, the term is immortalize the cells and essentially get them to keep growing in the lab forever. And some vaccines have been made and are currently made using those fetal cell lines or abortion-derived cells. Again, it's a ways back. So they're not using fetal tissue like David Daleiden was showing in the videos, and like we've been talking about and advocating against for the last few years, actually for quite a few years, but making headway in the last few years. They're actually not using stem cells. It's kind of an ordinary cell, but they keep it growing and growing and growing in the lab. And you might go, well, so why are they using these cells for vaccines? Well, if you're making a vaccine against a virus, viruses have to grow inside a cell. And so what they would do would be to take a dish of cells. Now it might be a fetal cell, but there are other cells that you can grow viruses in. But you put the virus into that dish of cells, and the virus grows and grows and grows inside the cell. Then you pop it open, collect a whole bunch of that virus, and you kill it or you weaken it, and that whole virus, now dead though, is what goes into my arm. That's the vaccine. So the connection here is you have to grow a virus in a cell, and some of the cells they're using are these fetal cell lines. And
so how many babies?
Abortion may have been decades ago, but you can still draw a line right back there to whether it's 1973 or 1962 or whenever. Those you still know where those cells came from, even though it's distant in time and space.
How many babies are going to be sacrificed for this vaccine?
Well, actually, there aren't going to be any more abortions. There's no ongoing abortion for these vaccines.
Right.
So you're a little bit distant. You're a little bit removed from that. There are really only about 4 main cell types or cell lines that they use nowadays derived from abortion. And again, there are illicitly derived alternatives, but those 4, the abortion took place for 2 of them in the 1960s, for 1 of them in the 1970s, and for 1 of them in the 1980s. There's no continuing ongoing abortion, but again, if you can draw that line right back, and many of us can, you just think about it, where did those cells originate? Back with that abortion.
Yeah, I hear you. This is sad, isn't it? That babies have to be sacrificed to save.
Yeah, I mean, you're still, and some people try to minimize it, and there's some reason for that, because it's decades ago, and you're not continuing to abort any young babies, but you're still using the material derived from that original abortion. There's still an exploitation based on destruction of that young life. So it's a matter of controversy. It's a matter of concern. Now, as time has passed, fortunately, a number of these companies have stopped using those abortion-derived cells to make vaccines that, what we're now calling the old-fashioned way, whole virus that you had to grow in cells. But now we're up to COVID-19 and all these vaccines that they're working on. In fact, the last time I checked, there was something like 230 different vaccines that companies around the world were trying to develop. I think we should just kind of narrow down here and focus on the warp speed ones. They're the top 8, probably the farthest along around the world, certainly in the US. And all of those are made not that old-fashioned way, but there are 4 new ways to actually make a vaccine against a virus like coronavirus now. And if we could just quickly go through that.
Go ahead.
The Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine are both what are called mRNA vaccines. That mRNA stands for messenger RNA. It's a messenger, or think of it as a recipe. In our cells normally, we've got our big old DNA genome that you might think of as a big recipe book. Let's say you want to make just one protein though, just one recipe. Maybe you just want to make chocolate cake. Well, you don't go through the whole book. You take that recipe to the kitchen. And essentially that's what an mRNA is. It's a recipe for just one single protein.
Right.
You copy that, and then the cellular machinery reads that single recipe. It makes that protein. The mRNA is not the protein itself. It's just the recipe, just like your recipe for chocolate cake isn't an actual chocolate cake, but you follow the instructions in your kitchen. You make that chocolate cake. Well, the cell follows the instruction in the mRNA and makes that protein. So what Pfizer and Moderna have done, as well as a number of other companies, is they took the sequence for just one protein from the COVID-19 virus.
Sure.
If your listeners have looked at that picture they always show of one of these coronaviruses and all those knobby spikes and projections on the outside, that's called the spike protein.
No.
Well, if you think about it, if our immune system was going to look at one of those viruses, how's it going to recognize it? That's the face that's on the wanted poster. That's what they should be looking at, because that's what our immune cells or our antibodies would first encounter. And so these newer ways to make a vaccine, like the mRNA one that Pfizer and Moderna use, is they simply take the genetic sequence. Somebody in China actually sequenced the genome of the virus and all the different proteins.
Yeah.
They simply take that sequence on a computer, manipulate it a little bit to make it last a little bit longer, and then synthesize it in the laboratory, literally in a test tube with some enzymes. There are no cells involved in this process.
That's good.
So we're moving away from having to use cells at all, and especially having to use those abortion-derived cells. They encapsulate that little recipe, that mRNA, in what's called a lipid particle. It's basically just an oil droplet, because it's made of the same kind of lipids or oils that our cell membranes are. So it quickly gets in. Our cell machinery makes that recipe for the virus spike protein, shows it to our immune cells, and you're vaccinated. You're ready, your immune system armed. There are other ways to make it and so on, but we've actually tried to put together sort of a visual primer on all of these different ways to make a vaccine against a virus. And your listeners can find that on our website.
Right.
The main website we've now upgraded a little bit. It's lozierinstitute.org, L-O-Z-I-E-R institute.org. And on that front page, you'll come across a little area with a button, what you need to know about COVID-19 vaccines. And so we've set up a whole area where you can look at this primer on how vaccines are made, including all of these new molecular methods, and then charts where we've tried to go through and say, as we looked at the published science papers, are they making this vaccine using one of those abortion-derived cell lines? Are there fetal cells involved with that or not? And there are some still coming forward that do rely on use of those aborted baby cells, the fetal cells.
Which concoction virus and company doesn't use?
Right. So that of the 8 warp speed ones, and we've got that chart also on our website, but out of the 8, the ones that don't use fetal cells in production, in other words, I'm designing and I'm actually making the vaccine that goes into that syringe. 6 of the 8 don't. Pfizer, Moderna, a company called Novavax, Sanofi, partnered with a company called GSK. Another one that's got a strange name, it's called Inovio, and then Merck.
So they're the ones
6 that are not using them in production.
Right. But how about testing?
That's another story. So when we talk about testing, what we're looking at is it's not something testing that was done so that you actually had any cell bits or whatever in the final vaccine. What they did was they took some of those vaccine products and they tested them on mice, or they tested them on cells actually in the culture dish to see if it makes that spike protein, to see if the mice make antibodies. And yeah, a bunch of them do use those abortion-derived cells in the testing. It's not involved in anything that goes into my arm, so it's another step away, but people need to understand that these companies are still, to some extent, relying on that. And of those warp speed ones, we know at least 6 do. There are 2 we can't tell yet because they haven't published their scientific information. People just need to be aware of all this. You're somewhat removed already if you're talking about just production, because remember, the abortion was decades ago. But there still could be even little bits of fetal cell proteins and so on in the vaccine if they used it for production. If they used it for testing only, it's not in what goes into my arm. But sadly, a lot of these companies still use some of those things. And our hope is that we're not too far away from they'll all say, no, we don't need to use that. There are other ethical ways, and there are other ethical cell types and other techniques and so on. It's just like the stem cell story. You don't have to rely on death and destruction or the cells that came from destroying a young human life. Even for little side testing and research studies, there are better ways, there are ethical ways. Our point is, as sort of the science folks out there, we're trying to just make sure you've got all the accurate information so that when you start to look at that and decide, do I want to take this vaccine? Well, I want to prevent, death and serious disease, but I'm concerned about, the ethics of all that.
Yes.
So at least you've got that information as you weigh that for yourself, for your family, for your community.
Can you show a little bit of that chart?
Let me hold up the brief chart, the one we've been discussing. And so this is the one, it just goes through those 8, the top ones in the warp speed. We've got a green square if they did not use abortion-derived cells in. This one is production, over here is testing. There's a red diamond to warn you if they do use those fetal cells in production or in testing. And remember, if they're using that, that means they're continuing to use it on and on and on. It's an integral part of the process. And then you'll notice over here in the testing column, we've got some that they're half green and half red because some of the tests did use those fetal cells, some of them didn't. I mean, we're really trying to prick the conscience of the scientists here to tell them that, hey, you know, there's a problem. Some people are going to be very, very concerned about this. You can use an alternative if you want. Now, a couple of them we haven't seen the evidence yet, so we can't tell you one way or the other.
You know, it makes me shiver to think that they're using human cells, whether they be elder or younger or a baby unborn, to shoot into someone's arm, even the trace of it. That to me, what is that? What's that word?
The fancy term is called excipients, but it's a trace contaminant.
Mm-hmm.
You still have, and in fact, in the package inserts for some of the current vaccines made using cells, whether it was a fetal cell or
Monkey.
a licit cell, yeah, monkey cell or hamster cells, they will tell you actually in there what goes into your arm. And you'll see that in some cases there's a little bit of cell debris or cell protein, and they will name the kind of cell that they use so you know which one was good or bad. But yeah, it gives pause to a lot of people just to think that there might be leftover bits of a cell from a baby that was aborted decades ago. Yeah, it's been a long time, but you know, again, you just need to be aware that there's that ethical thing. Whereas if they're using it in testing, okay, that's not going into my arm, but you know, we still would like to push all these companies to the point that they no longer use any of those cells because they don't have to.
You know, is there one pharmaceutical industry that is not using?
We have found a few examples. Remember, I said there are over 200 being worked on around the world. We've got a more detailed chart that actually, from this chart on our website, you can link directly to it. There's a lot of extra detail and so on, but we've surveyed a larger number, not just the top 8.
Yeah.
And there are a few. There's one by a company called CureVac. It's in Germany. And they're not close to having it available to any of us. And so now you have to kind of go through this thought process. Well, you know, I'm vulnerable. I fall into a high risk category myself for a couple of reasons. One being I'm a more senior member of our staff, right. and for some other physical reasons. Well, I have to start thinking about, should I go ahead and take the vaccine to prevent disease or to prevent passing it on to my family or to my community? What are the then ethical considerations I might make? We're not going to tell you how to make that decision, but we want to make sure you know all the facts before you make that decision. There are some coming up, but they're a distance away. Well, we've got Pfizer and probably within a few days, Moderna, which don't use fetal cells in the production, but did use it in some of the testing. And hard on their heels are AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, which do use fetal cells in the actual production of the vaccine. So I have to start thinking, you know, can I wait until something else comes up? If it comes up, because there's no guarantee. Yeah. There are a couple of companies that have hit roadblocks along the ways and totally stopped making their vaccine just because there was some problem in the process. So people need to think long and hard about all of these considerations, preventing death and serious disease, the ethics involved, whether it was in terms of production versus testing and so on, and how that affects you and your family and your community.
This is towards the end of the show. I'd like you on again, sir.
I'd love to be back on. There's so much to talk about,
I know.
so many issues. I mean,
I
we've
like
focused
people
down here
agreeing.
on vaccines, but there's a lot more going on, and there's going to be more to the vaccine story too.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is Patty Hunter of Patty's Page, and this is Dr. David Prentice. Thank you very much for coming on to my show. We'll see you again, eh?
You bet. Thanks so much, Patty.
Peace be with you and Merry Christmas.
God bless. Merry Christmas.
Bye-bye.
Godspeed.